We do welcome Michael Ruse, who holds an endowed chair in philosophy at Florida State University, Bruce Tiffney, a professor here at UCSB's Department of Geological Sciences, and Jonathan Wells, a biologist, senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, who will be participating in a panel discussion this afternoon on evolution. The format is as follows. We have approximately 2 hours together, of which the first hour and a quarter to hour and a half will feature their interaction over sets of questions largely that they have already submitted and that I will select from. I will add a few of my own. The questions will concern 3 themes. First, the nature, aims, and limitations of science, especially biological science, as this is a specific context in which evolutionary theory has been developed. B, the contemporary status of evolution as a scientific theory, including specific arguments related to its major variants, as well as anti-evolutionary theories. And finally, the political dimensions of contemporary discussions and debates over evolution, both in scientific circles and in society at large, for instance, American public education. Those will be the 3 themes: what is science, evolutionary theory, and its political dimensions that we will attempt to cover by means of the panel discussion over the next hour to hour and a half. We will use the remainder of the time to read selected questions that you have submitted, either via email prior to this event or via index cards at this event. My role is primarily, as I told the panelists, I'm up here as timekeeper and civility minder. I will, in all likelihood, exercise the unenviable responsibility of cutting short many good discussions so that we may cover the material at hand and allow for your questions at the end. I would also request at the outset that we all remember that this is indeed a panel discussion, not a formal debate. Even though frank exchange of differing views is encouraged, there are no winners or losers in the traditional sense. Each one of us has the freedom and the responsibility to come to our own terms with evolutionary theory, and that is best done, I believe, in an atmosphere of open, respectful, and spirited exchange that the university embodies. I would like to provide each of the panelists just a few minutes to introduce themselves and their connection with evolutionary theory before we begin with the panelist questions. Shall we start with Jonathan Wells on the far side? Go ahead, Dr. Wells.
I started my college education at Princeton in the early 60s as a geology major, dropped out after a few years to find myself, found myself driving a taxi cab in New York City for a while before being drafted. So I entered the U.S. Army, spent a couple of years in Missouri and Germany, got out, and by that time was thoroughly disenchanted with the Vietnam War, headed for Berkeley because that's where all the excitement was. Sorry, that's where it was in those days. Entered Berkeley, transferred to Berkeley, got called back up by the Army, and at that point refused. Got dragged off the street into a speeding limousine one morning and whisked off to military prison where I spent a year and a half between my junior and senior year. Finished up in physical science in 1970 and then headed for the hills and built a cabin. At that point, I got interested in religion. I also got interested in the evolution-creation controversies. I ended up going back to school in 1978 at Yale to get a Ph.D. in theology, where I studied basically all of Christian theology, but focused my research on the 19th century Darwinian controversies, the theological aspects. Got out of Yale, worked for a few years, but couldn't stay away from the controversy and ended up going back to school, crazy though it sounds. Well, actually, it is crazy. It doesn't just sound crazy. I went back for a second PhD at Berkeley, this time in biology. At Berkeley, I studied embryology and its relationship to evolution, finished in 1994, worked directing a medical laboratory for a few years before moving to Seattle in 1998, where I am now a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, writing, as you can imagine, controversial articles about the evolution-creation controversies. It seems I can't avoid controversy. It's been with me from the beginning, and I must confess, I love it.
Thank you very much. Professor Michael Ruse.
Well, I never thought that I would say this, but I feel awfully boring after Jonathan Wells. I expect, no, you're supposed to say, no, you're not at all.
No.
I really do have, in many respects, a very conventional life. I was born in England in 1940, started school at the age of 4, and at the age of 61, I'm still in school. I went to school. I went to University in Bristol. I emigrated to Canada, and within 2 days, I was at university in Canada. I started teaching at the University of Guelph in 1965. That's a provincial university in Ontario. And I retired from there in 2000, actually, a couple of years ago when I turned 60, and immediately took a job at Florida State. So I've been in the academic world all my life. And, you know, when I was a kid, people would say, oh, you're going to be a school teacher just like your mum. And I'd say, no. And here I am doing it all over again. I was brought up as a Quaker. My father was a conscientious objector in the war, and my parents joined the Quakers afterwards. And so I grew up as a Quaker, went to a Quaker school, and was firmly Christological, believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and all of those sorts of things. I guess about the age of 20, as tends to happen, I gave up stamp collecting, got interested in girls a bit before 20. But about the age of 20, my religious beliefs basically went. It would be nice to say it was the day I opened David Hume that they went, but I don't think that's true. It was just, somehow, it just didn't seem relevant to me particularly. I don't think I was ever a particularly militant atheist, but I guess I would describe myself at 25 as pretty atheistic. About the age of 40, I'd gotten interested in evolutionary theory. I'd never taken any biology at all when I was at school. As I was saying to our moderator last night, when I was at school, the really bright boys did Latin and Greek, and then the middle ones did math, physics, chemistry, and German. That was me. And then what we call the late developers did geography, Spanish, woodwork, and biology. So I had to write a Ph.D. thesis, and I got interested in evolution. I suspect I share this with Jonathan Wells, and it was sort of love at first gene, if you like, and a bit like a parent-child relationship. Some of us love them and some of us hate it, but you can't give it up. And I've been doing it ever since. I got involved in the creationist evolution debate around about 1980 when the first generation of this group, the so-called scientific creationists, started to make waves. And I've been interested ever since. I've been writing on and around it for the last 20 years. I'm an absolutely hardline evolutionist. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Darwinian. I think that even Richard Dawkins is a bit weak on these sorts of things. I mean, and I see adaptation everywhere. I'm somewhere to the right of Archdeacon Paley on these things. I would describe myself, I guess, these days as an agnostic, a skeptic. I don't think I'm an atheist, although I don't think that Jesus Christ died on the cross for my sins. And I guess that's about enough of an introduction for me for now.
Thank you very much. Professor Bruce Tiffney.
Well, I think each of us we're sort of working our way down the interesting levels of one's process of education. In some respects, I was preordained to be a professor of biology of some form because both of my parents had PhDs in biology before me, and my brother, who was 10 years older than I, had his PhD while I was still in high school. And so, okay, I know what I've got to go do. So I grew up knowing that very much I wanted to be a biologist, and specifically a biologist of plants. I also grew up in a household where I was sort of sitting between on the one hand, my father was a typical New England Congregationalist and my mother a Southern Baptist, which makes for some interesting discussions over matters of theology. I got into college and proceeded to take biology courses, and then by chance one day, and this is an advertisement for all of those of you who are undeclared majors, shopped around a little bit, took a geology course, which I had no concept what that was going to be like, and decided that this was just as much fun as biology. Promptly inquired, okay, how can I do both of these things? How can I do plants and fossils? Click, the light goes on, study fossil plants. So at that point, I became a double major and went on through to complete, well, all right, honesty is the first priority in science. No, I didn't quite get the double major. I missed the biology side of it by an organic chemistry course, but did everything else. So technically I was a geologist when I graduated. Went on and got my Ph.D. in the field of paleobotany, which is the study of very dead plants. Occupied a revolving chair of junior faculty for 10 years at Yale University. For those who are not aware of how the academic system works, you are first hired on as assistant professor without tenure. That is, you have no job security. And if they like you well enough, they give you job security after somewhere between 7 and 10 years, except at certain institutions like Yale, Harvard, and Princeton, where the junior faculty are acknowledged to be disposable, and I was disposed. Fortunately, having grown up on the East Coast, I was able to find a job on the West Coast and ended up here in Santa Barbara, which is, it took a little bit of getting used to for a Yankee, but I think I'm thoroughly Californicated at this point. Getting back to the question where the focus is today in the sense of evolution and religion, when I became a scientist, I did it purely out of love and fascination of working with rocks and plants. And it was something that, I sort of became a scientist by secondhand. Firsthand was I really wanted to go out and study the natural world and these particular kinds of organisms in the context of the fossil record. And indeed, I spent easily the first 7 or 8 years of my professional existence as a professor simply teaching the material with, in a very real sense, not thinking what science was about or what the processes of science involved. And it was a group of graduate students at Yale, actually, who grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, and several of them who had philosophical bents started to get me reading philosophy and history of science, caused me to come back around and begin to question exactly what this undertaking that I was doing was all about and how it worked. And of course, at the same time also, since paleontology is inherently an evolutionary biological subject, I also became perfectly familiar when somebody would stand up at the back of the room and yell, "That's bullshit," at the end of a lecture on something evolutionary and proceed to offer a theological debate that maybe some aspects of evolutionary biology caused upset and difficulty in the minds of some people who were seriously committed to Christianity. And so I began to study that side of it too. And over time, what I think I have come to the conclusion of is that one of the great failings of American education is that we are not teaching our students at any level how to think and the different ways in which thinking takes place. And I would say that one of the major things that I would hope could be instituted in all education, and which I try to institute in my introductory courses, is a distinction between what I would call belief knowledge ways of knowing about the world and research knowledge ways of knowing about the world, which is precisely what a debate between evolution on the one hand and creation on the other hand entails. And let me make it clear at the outset that I think both have absolutely equal standing. They are just very different.
Thank you very much. And as perhaps with increasing frequency you've suggested to me, I will indeed have to be time meister through this discussion. So you will hear me as we go.
Did you bring a water pistol?
I did not bring a water pistol, but there may be volunteers. Okay, well, go ahead, come forth if you have one in your pack. I will now proceed with asking you questions, first on the nature of science, and as you recall, the person who produced the question will be given the first chance to respond, but only for 2 minutes. Similar amount of time for the other two, then I will allow 5 minutes for the panel discussion before moving on to the next question. So we're starting again with the theme of the nature, aims, and limitations of science, specifically biological science. I'd like to start with a question that Bruce Tiffney gave, and this is his question. What is science, and why should we accept its findings? Go ahead, Bruce.
I give a whole lecture on this, and he wants 2 minutes. Okay. Science specifically is a group endeavor which allows a large number of people to, as a group, sample the natural world. Because we are dealing with a large number of people, there is a requirement of a protocol so that we can sort out amongst each other exactly what it is we think we see and agree upon the common nature of that. Because humans are fallible organisms, any observation that is made in the process of science must be repeatable by a large number of people, and it must be open to the potential of falsifiability, that it can be disproven. You cannot claim that it is completely undisprovable, because as soon as you do that, you put it outside of the realm of the nature of the endeavor. From the observations come hypotheses, and from the hypotheses you then generate, as it were, processes to explain the patterns you have seen in the facts of the world. By nature that it must be testable, all of science can only concern itself with the natural world. It cannot concern itself with the supernatural. By supernatural, I do not mean Casper the Ghost. I mean those things that are untestable or unobservable. Those are the realm of what I would call belief knowledge. As a result, what science comes down to be is a process that allows us to establish a hierarchy of probabilities of the explanations we humans have come up with for how the natural world works. As a result of that process of establishing probability, one of the hallmarks of science is that it is cumulative, that it builds on itself, and that it is constantly changing, and that its bottom line is always skepticism.
Final thoughts? Thank you. You did it. Jonathan Wells, what is science and why should we accept its findings?
I would define science slightly differently, although as a scientist, when I do an experiment, I certainly do not try to invoke the supernatural to explain my results. It seems to me that science is the search for truth. It's a subtle difference, but I think it matters because if I'm searching for the truth, part of the truth may be that there are things in heaven and earth that do not have natural explanations. And as a scientist who's seeking the truth, it's up to me to acknowledge that when I confront those limits, rather than insist, as some scientists do, that we must have a natural explanation for absolutely everything. Certainly we have natural explanations for some things, and some of them are better corroborated than others, but I do think that there are more things to reality than that.
Thank you. Michael.
Well, I think there's a number of ways that you can answer the question. I mean, obviously science is something that scientists do. And that's not entirely tautological, because I think that if you're going to give a full characterization of science, you've certainly got to take into account a lot of the things about the social structure of science, the refereeing process, and those sorts of things. So if I don't emphasize that, as it were, in my 2-minute definition, it doesn't mean that I don't think that these are very important things. I would go at it rather differently, perhaps because I'm a philosopher, and I would say this. I think science ultimately is the attempt to understand the world, the physical world, and that includes the mental world, in terms of unbroken natural regularity, in other words, in terms of law. And I think that this is what we see, the way that the whole notion of science, both the notion and the term itself, have evolved, particularly since the time of the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries, and certainly through the Darwinian era and on to our own time, that what we've seen is, as it were, the pushback of miracles, interventions, and all of these sorts of things, and the attempt to explain things through law. So, for instance, if, let us say, Bruce suddenly turned bright green, I wouldn't say, yes, the Archangel Gabriel has opened up the heavens and doesn't much care for that answer. I'd say, gosh, what did Bruce eat at lunchtime? Is this affecting his liver? He shouldn't have had that 5th drink at lunch, and those sorts of things. In other words, what I'm trying to do is explain it in terms of unbroken regularity. I think by definition now, I don't think it's stipulative, I think the way we use the term science is that it applies to the natural world, and that does not necessarily imply, therefore, that science is all knowledge, but that's what science is.
Thank you. Would you now like to ask or respond to the others' introductory comments on the nature of science?
Who, me? Who?
Any of you. This is the free-for-all time.
This is the free-for-all. Well, I will free-for-all then. Jonathan made the observation that he said that that science is the search for truth. He and I completely part company on that one because, as I said specifically, science is about generating, in my view, probabilities. A hierarchy of probabilities that are the best explanations of how we can interpret the natural world. Truth, as far as I am concerned, is something that does not belong in science. We are human. We don't know what truth is. We only try to approximate it in our science. Truth is something that belongs to belief knowledge.
Well, I hate to jump in here and defend Jonathan, but I've never heard such nonsense in my whole life.
Good.
I mean, how on earth can you possibly claim that the Earth is the center of the universe and that the sun goes round? I mean, truth. I mean, there comes a point where it's just nonsense to talk about probability, or that the DNA molecule is a double helix. What kind of probability? I mean, I think it's more probable that the DNA molecule is a double helix than that, let us say, you're not a man from Mars. You know what Men in Black is right, and that you're really an alien. How can you deny truth? I mean, I'm sorry, Jonathan.
Oh, no, go for it.
I deny truth because of the mechanisms of science and the fact that science is done by humans. And I would agree with you that the double helix is very probably a double helix, and that, yeah, gravity still works. It's probably true. But we never know what we are going to find out in the future. After all, it was a Earth-centric universe to very brilliant people a millennia ago. Or Earth-centric solar system. It is now a sun-centric solar system. Who knows what we are ever going to find in the future? To say that something is true presumes that we know the absolute. And as a scientist, I think that one has to be always open to the potential, tiny though it may be, that you got it wrong.
I completely agree. While I believe that science is the search for truth, I do not believe that any person finds absolute truth, at least in anything but a fleeting or minuscule way. So I agree with you about the probability question. I also agree with you that in many cases at least, and Michael will probably jump on me now, that scientific hypotheses should be in some sense falsifiable and or repeatable. Since obviously the discussion here today is about evolution, the history of life, among other things, I would ask, how do we know that certain unrepeatable events in the history of life are therefore explainable by science? We can neither repeat them nor observe them, except very indirectly.
Brief final comments.
Well, I still think that you guys aren't using the word probable in the way that we would normally use it. I mean, for instance, Jeff, for instance, sitting on the second, third row in the audience, for instance, I've known Jeff for 2 or 3, 5, 10 years, whatever it is. Now, I could say, I think it's highly probable that Jeff is a sincere Christian. We've talked together, and we've gone through all of those sorts of things and everything like that. If somebody told me, though, well, really and truly, Jeff can't afford to lose the job or something like that, and that he's got doubts, I can take that in. So if somebody says, yes, your belief that Jeff is a deeply sincere Christian is not absolute, I think that there's a possibility for that. Of course, sometimes we use probability more generally. I mean, your girlfriend, does she really love me? Yes, I think it's highly probable. Or, well, frankly, I don't think it's highly probable. I mean, poor old Brendan, I was talking to him at lunchtime about, is your marriage going to last? And he was saying, well, I hope so, I think so, but if it didn't, I don't think we'd think that, his world would collapse, but not for the rest of us. But I just don't know what it means. I just don't know what it means to say that Ptolemy is right and Copernicus is wrong. I mean, it seems to me we get to the point where some things are true and some things are not. If somebody said to me, it's only probable, Mike, that you've got, let us say, male genitalia because you haven't checked it since you last went to the lavatory. I mean, I'd say, friend, you've been taking too much philosophy. Have you thought of doing, some simple thing like geology or something where you don't have to think so much? Some things are established, and it's no longer reasonable to talk about probability there. I would want to say that Copernicus is established, and so I can trail my coat here. I don't even think that evolution's probable. I think it's true.
Thank you, Michael Ruse. We move on to our second question on science, and this question was inspired by Jonathan Wells' question that he posed. I'll read your question, Jonathan, but I changed it. substantially. You'll get the first crack at the answer, but it won't exactly be yours. Jonathan asked, is the essence of science to learn about reality by comparing hypotheses with evidence, or to explain the whole of reality in terms of natural causes? It was that latter phrase that was interesting to me, because I think it suggests that he was concerned about science having particular metaphysical commitments, and that's where I would like to pose a slightly different question for the panelists. The issue then would be whether science in general has any metaphysical commitments. These are commitments as to the ultimate nature of reality. For instance, that the universe is entirely comprised of matter, and hence there is no need to invoke supernaturalistic explanations of what are entirely naturalistic phenomena, or perhaps a metaphysical commitment to some form of uniformitarianism, which undergirded, of course, Bruce's profession, but also an answer that Michael Ruse gave. I'd like to not ask that question in the abstract, though. I'd like to bring it down to the level of our own lives, that is, whether each of us, or whether scientists in this case, can ever separate our work from our personal metaphysical commitments. The two indeed seem to be highly correlated in most instances. So I would like to know, of the panelists, of your own metaphysical beliefs in 2 minutes or less, specifically your position as to the existence and nature of God. Michael has already shown part of his cards on that. And let me remind you, this is not the McCarthy era, and there are no witch hunts going on. So please be candid. And whether you feel your metaphysical commitments have any impact whatsoever on how you view science. Who would like to begin?
I'll give it a
Jonathan,
shot.
you're leaning toward the mic.
It seems to me that having studied philosophy, not as much as Michael, but some, that there's no such thing as anybody with no metaphysical commitments. There are plenty of people who have them and don't know it. I think it's impossible to do anything without some metaphysical commitments. The question is, what are they? Just a brief anecdote, when I studied theology at Yale, I was required to take courses in philosophy so I could become aware of my metaphysical superstructure or substructure. When I was taking biology as a grad student at Berkeley, I was discouraged from taking courses outside the department, especially philosophy courses. And so I find that biologists, at least, I don't know about geologists, in general, are woefully naive when it comes to philosophy. Now, what are my personal metaphysical commitments? It seems to me that in order to do science, I assume that the universe is at least largely understandable, that there is such a thing as natural law, natural regularity, that we can make inferences about the past, we can repeat experiments in the present, and so on and so forth. I also happen to believe that God is real. I don't claim that to be a scientific claim, but I believe that on the basis of my own personal experience. I'm not sure what else you want to hear from me. I mean,
Do you see an affinity between your metaphysical beliefs and your understanding of science?
Absolutely. I think that's inseparable in any case for anybody.
Thank you. Michael.
Well, I agree. I don't think that anybody can go through life without having certain basic commitments, prejudices, these sorts of things. I'm not sure that I'd always want to call them metaphysical, because that seems just a little bit heavy to me, but certainly, if you like, and obviously this is a place where I disagree apparently with Bruce, I do have certain commitments about the way the world works, metaphysical, if you like, about regularity and those sorts of things. And then, of course, I've got certain sort of cultural commitments. I don't know whether they're where the metaphysics ends and where the culture takes up. I mean, you know, beliefs that the English are superior to everybody else and things like that. I didn't think that was funny, folks. I mean, quite seriously, I do think that one does have these sorts of beliefs. I mean, I suspect that most of us here, for instance, whatever we might talk about, whatever it is, most of us think that a certain form of democracy is the best way, and a certain kind of tolerance and those sorts of things. Do you want to call those metaphysical? Do you want to call those cultural or what? I'm not quite sure, but certainly I think that we've all got those sorts of things, and I think that science and religion, or one's attitude, are very much part and parcel of them. Where do I stand on the God question? Well, I don't believe in the existence of a God. I guess I I certainly don't think that that Jesus was the Son of God. So at that level, if you like, I'm an atheist. But at another level, rather like Charles Darwin, there are days when I just say, well, but the whole thing, I know there's no proof to it, but could it all be meaningless? I just don't know. I mean, I very much hope it's not all meaningless. I mean, I very much hope I'm going to heaven and that there will be lots of Mozart operas and fish and chips and other things that I like. Lots of sex. Because I want these things, I'm very dubious that they're going to occur. The God I don't believe in is not a very nice God. The God I don't believe in is a Presbyterian who's out to get me. So as I say, I don't have those sorts of beliefs. I really, truly don't have those God sorts of beliefs. But as I say, I would certainly agree with Jonathan that human beings generally, and certainly Michael Ruse in particular, do have various kinds of background beliefs which make up the way that we look at the world. Although, as I say, whether one should call these metaphysical, cultural, or what, I don't particularly want to say myself because I don't think there's an answer.
Thank you. Bruce.
Okay, first as to the degree to that other factors, metaphysical or cultural, influence science, I would say absolutely so, and that is the sort of major take-home message of the talk that I will give tomorrow evening, that I think there is a strong case to be made that the success of science comes from its arising in Western Europe under a Judeo-Christian tradition, which brings with it almost immediately a sense of directionality, of a passage and directionality in time, of a purpose, of an orderliness to the universe. Indeed, one of the reasons why early science, I think, is as successful as it was in Europe is that it assumed an orderly world. So instead of approaching the world as a complete puzzle, when you looked at it, you knew it was created by a very rational God and therefore was rationally knowable. And I think a lot of that baggage is still very much with us. And I think that many people look at science, biology, and beyond, thinking of the world as orderly and bringing with it that sort of cultural baggage. Indeed, sitting in the audience, who's already been picked on once before, Brendan Larson, who's a graduate student in the interdisciplinary program in this university, is very much interested in a question I find quite fascinating, which is, how do you suppose evolutionary biology would be carried on by a bunch of Shintoists or a bunch of Buddhists, as versus the people who normally do evolutionary biology, who carry with them some of the Christian background that is part and parcel of our native culture that so just completely surrounds us, so we cannot get away from some of those basic values. So I certainly think that science in its origin, evolutionary biology being part of science in its origin, carries with it a cultural baggage and a set of blinders that with time we will learn more as we go along. Then the second half, how does that influence me? Well, I am neither a theist, a deist on the one side, nor an atheist on the other side, because I see both of those as very similar to each other. They are both about belief. In one case you believe, and in one case you believe not to believe. They're about belief. I'm an agnostic. I don't know. I haven't got enough information yet. The only place so far where I sort of start to fail, as it were, in a sense of a naturalistic universe, I'm perfectly happy with everything the physicists and the astrophysicists tell me back until they talk about the Big Bang and we get something from nothing. We got a problem there. And something from nothing at this point is the one place where I am willing to let an old lady in a long white gown come in and go, poof. By the way, I point out the only time God ever identified God, spoke of God as themselves, was the burning bush, which as far as I know is sexless. So I think that making God he is, an act of hubris on the part of the writers of the Bible. So let's stick with she for the time being for equal time.
Thank you very much. Brief discussion, specifically over the possible circularity of making claims using science if the scientists who make those claims are making them based on certain metaphysical and other cultural presuppositions that are essentially substantiated by those scientific claims.
Well, I have an answer for that one, just to jump in because I'm closer to you than block the rest of these gentlemen off for a moment. But the whole purpose of science is, and one of the reasons I think it is one of the three beautiful creations of human intellect, the other two being religion and arts in the most general sense, is that science is self-correcting. It's always self-testing. And so I grant fully that it's riddled through with errors right now, but the whole purpose of science is if pursued properly, we will slowly root those errors out even as we commit new ones.
Jonathan? Michael?
I don't think the enterprise is inherently circular unless you start claiming that the results of your efforts are evidence for the presuppositions with which you began. I mean, now to some extent they can be. I mean, if a presupposition leads to fruitful work, it justifies the presupposition. But when you forget that you have a presupposition, and unfortunately I have found this frequently among some of the scientists I've met, quite honestly, they can't tell a presupposition from a conclusion, some of them. And I think this is an appalling naivete, philosophically. And I think that does lead one into the circularity that you perhaps are referring to. I think it's better to acknowledge your presuppositions and say, given these presuppositions, this is what I expect to find. This is what, in fact, I do find. Does it work or not? That, to me, is the way science should be done.
Jonathan, I want to go back to the point that you made, and I think it was a serious point that the people at Berkeley weren't prepared to let you take philosophy. I think that Thomas Kuhn, who in fact was a philosopher or a historian, certainly at Berkeley for a while, put his finger on a point here. I think that successful science is successful when you don't get too self-reflective. Kuhn makes the point that at least as long as science is working, you don't worry about the presuppositions, you just keep going. It's when science starts to break down and things don't work that you start to get more philosophical. I mean, you take, say, something like taxonomy. When I was coming into philosophy of biology 30-odd years ago, they were philosophy all the way. And then as Cladism took over and started to work, now, the average Cladist wouldn't know Karl Popper if you shoved it up their bottom. So I'm not sure that speaking now as a non-scientist, I'm not sure that I would want to condemn scientists quite as much as you seem to be doing for not being self-reflective. I'm inclined to think that there's something to be said for science, that you've got to heads down, folks, and you've got to get on. It's like being a doctor. If you're going to get too sensitive, then don't be a doctor. If you can't walk away from it, I'm not saying that you should always walk away from it every time, but if you can't walk away from that sick child when you go home, you're not going to function very well as a pediatrician. And I suspect that science works a lot better a lot of the time if you're not too self-reflective. I'm not saying never be self-reflective, but I wouldn't want to condemn scientists quite as heavily as you do. Don't forget, you were corrupted by doing theology at Yale before you got to Berkeley.
Was it the theology or the philosophy?
Well,
well, I agree with you, Michael. I think it would be terrible for science or for an experimentalist to sit around the lab philosophizing all the time. We're talking here about striking the right balance, and I think the right balance is to not philosophize all the time, but at least know when you're asserting something on the basis of your presuppositions rather than on the basis of evidence. Now, I would say, and here's where we're going to really see some sparks fly, that that's exactly what we have in the case of evolution.
Well, there's a segue. Thank you, Jonathan.
Can I
Our
break
second,
in?
I'm sorry.
Can I break in on the previous topic? No.
Can you break in 30 seconds on the previous topic, Bruce?
30 seconds.
Go ahead.
One of the greatest dangers in science is indeed when people begin to believe science, and I mean believe science much as they would believe a religion. And I think that the one place where a broad education would serve scientists well is that they get away from this sense that science has all the answers.
Thank you.
Oh, I disagree, but I don't have 30 seconds to disagree in, do I?
Okay, and Michael Ruse disagrees with what you just heard. Our second theme is the contemporary status of evolution as a scientific theory, including scientific arguments related to its major variants, as well as anti-evolutionary theories. I will start with a question posed by Michael Ruse, so now you'll get your 2 cents worth. A very general question. Do you think evolutionary theory is scientific? And what about its rivals? Go ahead, Michael.
Absolutely. I don't think there are any rivals. At least I don't think
That was
there
quick.
are any viable rivals. Of course, there have been rivals to evolutionary theory. I mean, there have certainly been rivals to Darwinian evolutionary theory within evolution. I mean, theories like Lamarckism, the inheritance required characteristics. Despite what Bruce says, that's wrong. It's not even probably wrong. That's wrong. There have certainly been rivals in the past to evolutionary theory, ideas of special creation, and I suppose today we've got the intelligent design theorists, the people who claim that at some point there are interventions, and they're wrong too. Evolutionary theory, the fact of evolution, I think, is unambiguously true. The only way that one can make sense of the living world is by presupposing descent by modification from, as Charles Darwin said, one or a few forms. The particular paths of evolution, I'm fully aware that there is much controversy about this. I think that we are now pretty decided on some of the major links, that, for instance, the birds are descended not just from the reptiles, but from the dinosaurs, that humans come from Australopithecus afarensis and things like that. But clearly, there's lots of questions, particularly about the beginning of the Cambrian, and maybe these are questions that will never be solved. As far as the mechanism is concerned, Darwinism, natural selection, is the major mechanism. I think it is the major mechanism, and I think it will continue to be the major mechanism. That doesn't mean to say natural selection is everything. I mean, in the last 20 years, there have been major advances done by embryologists, developmental embryologists, and all sorts of findings, which I see as complementary to Darwinism rather than conflicting with it. But as far as evolution is concerned, I think it's true. True, not probable, true.
Bruce.
Sorry, I was expecting you to go in the other direction, so my mind was somewhere else. Is evolutionary theory scientific? Yes. What about its rivals? I think it has none in science at this time. I would say in response to Michael that I regret to say there actually are some Lamarckian bacteria out there. But they are such a tiny portion of the history of evolution that they are not, I think, an important footnote to the history of life on Earth. And I think one of the major difficulties that evolutionary theory has in the present day comes back to, indeed, the comment that I made, that I forced out of you at the end of the previous one, is that we act as though, again, scientists are dealing with the truth. And when we do that, we throw ourselves open to, I think, very justifiable criticism by a whole slew of other folk, including the religious side of the world, which has, I think, the only belief knowledge has the only claim upon truth. And we need to be very careful about that. One of the things, by the way, as a footnote, while I am very respectful of poor old Charlie Darwin, I think speaking of Darwinism is one of the mistakes that we make, because you see the little Jesus fish wandering around on the back of cars, and then you see the little Darwin fish with feet. Well, you know what the Darwin fish with foot says is that Charles Darwin is somehow or other, as an image, equivalent to Jesus. Now, I'm sorry, Charles Darwin is not a saint. He never aspired to be one. And we have to watch that kind of thinking as well as that kind of iconography. The whole question of evolutionary biology and evolutionary theory is one of constant change, constant questioning. And so far, that is the best hypothesis that is out there. But let me end with this comment. I don't believe in evolution by natural selection. Didn't hear any gasps, so the audience is not being responsive. What I believe is the process of research knowledge that generates scientific hypotheses, of which evolution by natural selection is the one that has A, explained the most evidence that we see, observations that we see in the present day, and has withstood most effectively attempts to disprove it.
I would remind our panelists the question at hand is, do you think evolutionary theory is scientific? And what about its rivals? Jonathan.
Well, I've already said that I think science is the search for truth. In a case like this, it proceeds by comparing theory with evidence, hypothesis with evidence. Now, I'm not a Kuhnian, but I was inspired by him in my days at Berkeley, which, by the way, were the days of the controversy over the drifting continents, which was still hot stuff then. But one thing Kuhn said is you sort of make a switch in your mind to see things in a different way. And let me just propose to you a switch that happened to me maybe 10 years ago. From being someone who basically accepted what was being told to me about evolution, the larger aspects, that is, descent with modification here, I became a skeptic. And from being someone who just took it for granted, I started looking for the evidence. And the evidence for this claim that all modern organisms are descended from one or a few ancestral forms actually has surprisingly little evidence in my book. If we look at the fossils, we see major discontinuities like the Cambrian explosion. If we look at the embryos, the most famous embryo pictures show vertebrate embryos developing from basically identical early embryos. We now know that those pictures were faked, and yet Darwin called this by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of his theory of common ancestry. We look at the molecular evidence, the evidence for natural selection and mutation. I could go on, but basically I find it strikingly insufficient to make the claim probable, much less true.
Well, I'm sure there's not much to talk about. We could just go on to the next question, or?
I don't know which one
okay,
I'm
if you can think of anything.
for at the moment. I thought at least it was going to be 2-1, but it turns out I'm the only one with any common sense on this panel. I mean, really and truly, I mean, if you had a student, Bruce, who handed in a paper and you'd asked them, say, some chemical formula or something like that, H2O or something like that, and they had said that water was CO2, okay? And you handed it back false. And they said, oh, excuse me, Professor Tiffney, but it's all a question of probability, and my commitment is to water being CO2. Would you pass that student?
No, because I would have first of all established with them that the majority of individuals operating within the constraints of science have agreed that H2O is H2O.
So, in other words, this is a kind of democracy gone wrong, and in Florida, where we have voting problems, it's quite possible that a student at FSU could hand in and say the Chads went the other way, water is CO2. That is, I mean, you've read too much Popper. I mean, really and truly, I mean, your professors were absolutely right. I mean, philosophy for scientists is not a good thing. I mean, really and truly, you know absolutely that water is H2O. It is not probable that water is H2O. It is like that it's probable that Jeff is a Christian. It is not probable that I have male genitalia because I haven't checked for the last 10 minutes. Water is H2O.
And likewise,
it's not a question of voting. It's
Michael,
not a question of, just a minute, it's not a question of California versus Florida. I mean, this isn't a presidential election. Water is H2O, and you mark your students wrong when they say that it's wrong.
and by analogy, you're arguing that evolution is correct, not just probable.
Oh, well, that's
Yes,
another matter.
correct?
But I'm just going at it.
Just getting
generally.
Well, no, we're back
I
onto
don't wanna
evolution
upset
here,
people.
Michael. Go ahead.
Well, I'll make two brief comments. One to the overwhelming majority of opinion issue. Christianity in the Middle Ages was defined as, or Christian orthodoxy, I should say, was defined as that which is believed by everyone everywhere, all Christians everywhere, that is. Well, the interesting thing about the definition is the minute you stop believing it, you're no longer a Christian. And so the definition remains true, but you're not a Christian. You're a heretic or something else. If we define science in such a way that Darwinism must be true, then anyone who disagrees with it is by definition no longer a scientist, and so the proposition remains true that most scientists believe in Darwinian evolution. And I see that happening, not necessarily in this room, but I see it happening on university campuses. Second of all, it seems to me a preferable way to go about it is to look at the evidence. And as I said, until approximately 10 or 12 years ago, when I started becoming a biology grad student at Berkeley, looking at the evidence for myself, I believed the overall framework. I didn't believe that natural selection could do the job, but I believed in the descent with modification stuff. And then I looked at the evidence, and I found it sadly wanting. And to me, that's the ultimate test of a scientific claim.
Okay, I'll let Michael deal with the first go, which sounded suspiciously like a syllogism to me. I'd like to hop back one step further. And just, you may have said that the evidence was not appropriate and withstood the scrutiny. And then you said that, for example, the very basis of Haeckel's idea of embryos that Darwin saw as such a strong support for his evolution by natural selection was subsequently determined to be, I think, fake was the basic of the...
Not my term. It's been in the literature.
And the point that I would bring up in that is that you're here citing a historical occurrence. If Charles Darwin were alive today, he would probably reject exactly that Haeckelian interpretation, as many biologists have since then. The whole process of developing a scientific hypothesis goes through historical periods where it tests data, throws out old ideas that it stood very strongly on before, and picks up new. I will I will inform most of the members of the audience that, we wouldn't have even had this debate at 1902, because at that point Darwinism was in complete eclipse because it had been tested and found to be completely wanting in light of the existing scientific data on how organisms reproduce. Darwinism was out. They were looking for other solutions at that point. It's only after the rediscovery of Mendelian genetics that evolutionary biology came forward again in the 1930s, and that Darwin's hypothesis was pulled back out of the dustbin, dusted off, and sent forth to arrive at where it is in the present day. And very well may be that at some day in the future, the essence of a Darwinian hypothesis of evolution by natural selection is falsified and we start all over again.
Very good. We move on to our second question on evolution. This is a question that was posed by Jonathan Wells. Tim Berra's 1990 book, Evolution and the Myth of Creationism, uses Corvette automobiles to illustrate the evolution of organisms through Darwinian descent into modification. In Darwinian theory, however, organisms evolve solely through natural processes, such as selection and variation. How do Darwinists know that living things are not likewise produced by intelligent design? And Jonathan, you may begin.
Well, Berra used the automobiles to illustrate descent with modification, and he said that the evidence from his example was overwhelmingly obvious. Now, if we watched a 1954 Corvette morph into a 1958 Corvette through purely natural processes, I would say this is exactly what Darwin was talking about. But what we see instead is a process of design, intelligent engineers crafting automobiles one after the other, building on older models for ideas, but adding design in the process. How do we know the same thing doesn't happen with organisms? And by the way, most of Darwin's contemporaries thought that that is what happens with organisms, that it is a process of design. Well, we could know if we see this natural process. The process that Darwin proposed was variation and selection. We have abundant evidence for selection within species, just as we've had for centuries in the process of domestic selection. When we look at variation, to produce new variation, we rely, in modern Darwinian thought, on genetic mutation. And there are some genetic mutations that do provide new variation, such as in bacterial antibiotic resistance and other forms of toxin resistance. But when we look for anatomical changes due to beneficial mutations, we don't find them. Now, maybe we do in some plants. I want to leave that bracketed. I'm talking about animals, which is my field. We just don't see them. Now, if we saw the process working, I think an extrapolation over geological time would be warranted, but I don't see the process to begin with. And that's why I think the question, I'm not saying that the evolutionary record, the history of life, provides evidence for design. I'm merely saying that the issue has not been resolved until we find that natural mechanism.
Michael.
Well, let's talk a little bit, let's sort of focus the argument a little bit more. And let's leave natural selection a little bit on one side for the moment, not out of weakness, because I believe in it, but let's go back to the whole question, as I said, the fact of evolution. And you see, this is where people like Jonathan have me dropping my jaw, because I don't understand how one can say that there's no good evidence for evolution. I mean, the fossil evidence is part of it. It's not the only part of it, but certainly the fossil evidence is part of it. And there's certainly, you're quite right, there are many gaps in the fossil record, and there are many questions, but there are places, for instance, the evolution of the mammalian ear, where there's very detailed fossil evidence from places like the Karoo, as we see forms which start off reptilian and move towards mammalian. More recently, for instance, the evolution from land animals back to the whales, the cetacea. I mean, now they've been digging up evidence in places like Egypt and I gather Pakistan. I mean, 20 years ago, there wasn't this evidence, and now we've got more and more evidence of this going on. Humans, I mean, the evidence that we've got of humans from Australopithecus to Afarensis. Now, nobody's saying we've got all the details. Big debate even on CNN this morning about the status of the Neanderthals. So I'm not saying we've got all the evidence. So that's one thing. Then again, but it's not the only part of the evidence for evolution. We've got geographical distributions. How does one explain the distribution of the thing that spurred Darwin? How does one explain those tortoises on the Galapagos archipelago? Similar, but not quite the same. How does one explain what are now known as Darwin's finches? Similar, but not quite the same. I mean, if one's going to give a naturalistic explanation, then this is the way to go. Again, evolution makes good sense of this, and I think, and I'll make this point incidentally in my talk tonight, I think that Darwin said God couldn't have been so silly to have done it by special creation there. So this is another thing. Homologies. Why is it that the forelimb of human and bat and horse and whale, and all used for different things, but the bones are the same bones in the same order? More than this, of course, the molecular evidence now shows that we've got homologies not only amongst the vertebrates, but that we've got it right across the animal world, that the same genes seem to be involved in triggering the development of the Drosophila leg and the vertebrate leg. Now, you know, one can go the way of Philip Goss and say, well, God put these there to test our faith. But I think theologically that's not a very good answer, and I think scientifically it's no answer at all. So this is what I would want to say is the evidence for evolution. I'm leaving natural selection on one side for the moment. I want to say that the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. And let me add, I think from a Christian perspective or a religious perspective, one ought to be accepting this.
Bruce.
Jonathan started off using the comment about Tim Barra's use of Corvette automobiles to illustrate the evolution of organisms through Darwinian descent into modification. I think it's appropriate to observe that what Barra actually did is he was trying to make the point about if you see two distantly related organisms, it might be difficult to interpret them as related, but if you saw all the intermediates, you would understand the changes. So he was talking about how incremental change is apparent if you look at the year-by-year model transitions, but not apparent if you were to take a 53 Corvette and compare it to the most recent model. So it was not, Barra was in no way implying that somehow or other Corvettes evolved and that is a homologous argument as to how an organism might evolve. Michael's done a very good job of pointing out and this is, I don't understand why anybody who wishes to argue about evolution at this point talks about the lack of intermediates. At this point, we're swimming in them. And I think that Michael's made that point reasonably well. Jonathan also said, though he excluded plants from this, said that there are no clear connections between genetic sequences, gene change, and morphological change. Well, here we have a problem. I am not a molecular biologist. Like most people in my field, when I'm teaching a general course, I spend time reading. And I pick up not from an enormous knowledge of this literature, but from having done a little homework on this particular get-together. There are those who would disagree very strongly with Jonathan on this and who would claim that there is plenty of adequate information out there and evidence for direct association of genetic and morphological change. So there, he and I just have to simply look at each other, and it's a he said situation. And anybody wants some references, I'll give you a reference to start you off at the end of this. But simply, that's a contention you make, and it's a contention that many of us would seriously disagree with.
Discussion. Go ahead, Jonathan.
On the intermediate forms, except perhaps for the Cambrian explosion, I'm not denying the existence of intermediate forms. Michael mentioned the mammalian ear series, the recently discovered whale evolution fossils. What I'm saying is that contra Tim Barra, I'll give you those intermediates, and it still doesn't get you descent with modification in the Darwinian sense. What it gets you is a series of different forms which could have been designed or could have been produced by descent with modification. How do we know? We know if we can provide the natural mechanism. I don't think we have it. When it comes to clear connections between morphology and genetic changes, again, it's a he said situation, but it's common knowledge among developmental geneticists that and actually evolutionary geneticists, that there is a distinct lack of correlation in many cases, if not most, between genetic and morphological differences. There are cases where there are correlations. I'm saying that as a general rule it does not hold, and therefore I doubt the mechanism.
But Jonathan, can I come back at you here? I mean, sure, I think mechanisms are important, but I'm not sure that your argument holds up. I mean, suppose Jeff did something very strange that we didn't, it was very odd. And people, it was so strange. I mean, he came up and said, "I'm Jesus Christ," and took off all his clothes and ran out, with his hand. Now, I suspect people out who'd not seen that and who know Jeff, let us say Phil Hefner or others would say, is that true? Is that true? And I could imagine, though, that they could be convinced of the fact that he did this very peculiar thing. I mean, that there are witnesses that they would rely on, and maybe that it's on camera, things like that. And you look carefully, it's not an actor made up to look like Jeff. And yes, you establish that, yes, indeed, he did it, without necessarily knowing why he did it. Now, was he doing it just to make a philosophical point? Had he been offered a $10,000 reward if he would do it? Did Sir John Templeton want? Was this a Templeton Award? Was he psychotic? I mean, sure, one would be looking for the reason why he did this very peculiar thing. But it seems to me it's quite possible for somebody to establish that he did in fact do it without knowing why. And as I understand you, I don't want to misunderstand you here. You're saying unless we've got a cause, we cannot say that it happened. And I'm saying the Jeff example seems to me a case where we could well establish that it did happen without knowing why.
I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I didn't go into detail earlier, but I am certainly no believer in a 6-day, 6,000-year creation. I accept the fossil record at face value. I'm asking, what does it show us? It shows us that things have changed over time, or at least that what we see now is not what we used to have. Clearly, it shows us that. So I don't doubt the changes in whale evolution or the changes in the mammalian jaw development. But what I'm saying is, I don't need to know why it happened, but in order to determine whether it happened by design, as in the case of the automobile, or by Darwinian processes, purely natural processes, we have to have those processes well established, and we don't.
I think that, what we're coming down to here is very much the crux of the entire question. And that is, does one want to believe in the solution before you have arrived at it? And I think Jonathan very much and sincerely has the conviction that God did it and wishes to allow God access to the creation in one form or another, whether by natural law, you've excluded fiat and miracles in some sense, or whether we are going to try to explain the apparent patterns of evolution by natural causes. And for example, backtrack. The bottom line is, if we are doing science, by definition, science deals with the natural, not with the supernatural. So, we create a hypothesis that operates inside of the natural world that we are privileged to observe and work with. We can be completely full of shit. And God could have either be up there manipulating us day by day, and every one of you is here by careful plan. God can be operating by having created natural selection and is sort of sitting back there watching it do its thing according to plan. We have no way of knowing. That takes us beyond to another level of debate that I think is more philosophical. If we are doing science, we could admit those may be possibilities, but if we're doing science, we have to stick to the natural world.
Very briefly.
I am not asserting that God did it, although I may happen to believe that. What I'm asserting here is the conceptual point that we cannot determine whether it's design or natural processes without the evidence. You say that we find evidence by spinning a naturalistic hypothesis and going to look for evidence for it. Well, that's fine, but when we don't find the evidence, it seems to me it's time to say, well, maybe we were wrong.
There are many dimensions of this we haven't, of course, covered around evolutionary theory, and I think we will be able to from some of your own questions that we'll be asking later. I'd like to move now to the final theme, and that's the theme of the political dimensions of contemporary discussions and debate over evolution, both in scientific circles and in society at large, for instance, American public education. We have time for only one question, and all three of you posed the same basic question, which is essentially, how do you account for, how do you understand these political dimensions of the debate? And I'd like to give you each a chance to address that. But first, I'd like to tweak the question just a bit and have you kind of answer 1.5 questions to start. I think most participants in the evolution debate believe that their side is entirely politically pure and untainted, while the opposition is clearly politically motivated. If by politics, however, we simply mean the exercise of power to attain a desired end, then I suspect it's inevitable that all sides in the evolution debate have their political dimensions. What I'd like to do now is, in the interest of fairness and disclosure, I'd like to start, and after you do this, please continue with your own 2 cents worth on these political dimensions, by asking each of you to state any connections you currently have with scientific, religious, or other potentially relevant organizations. And for each, please tell us whether this connection has provided any form of political support for your position. Let's start with Bruce, please.
Member of the Botanical Society of America, the Geological Society of America, Society for the Study of Evolution, Paleontological Society, International Association of Wood Anatomists, International Paleobotanical Organization, California Botanical Society, that's probably about a third of them. Political support, I send them money. I get a journal in return so I can read about the exchange of ideas of others. Political party, I'm an independent. I'd prefer to throw bombs more than anything else because I think all of them are rascals. That's putting it politely. What else do you want to know? Have I covered it? Have I missed something you want?
That's a good start. Now you go ahead and open up to the political nature of the debate over evolution and your take on it.
What I am most interested in is, as I tell my students in my introductory course, you can come in here being a creationist and you can leave here being a creationist, and I honor you for doing so. My requirement is only that you be broadly educated and you understand all of the aspects that go into your existence as a member of the United States of America. That you understand the arguments and the implications of those arguments that are being offered by various fields of science for your survival, the country's survival, etc. This debate has been, or discussion has been by and large reasonably civil and has been held on a fairly high plane. Most people who believe in intelligent design are much more likely to push a very strong biblical view and to do it to the exclusion of understanding of what science is really telling us about the world we live in. I think that the greatest danger is that when we start to wish and to believe in scientific outcomes that will benefit us and protect us without really understanding what the science underneath those outcomes may hold in our future. Something like global warming, for example, where a lot of people would really like to believe it's not going to be all that bad. But if you look at the history of the past Earth and what might happen from that, understanding science and the limits of science, and as well as what it can tell us, could give us a very different viewpoint. So I think that this whole debate is an extremely important one in the political sphere because it really is going to influence the ways human beings know, and the way that people know influences how they vote, and how they vote is going to have major influences on the world as a whole.
Thank you. Michael.
Well, first of all, I think you have to recognize that this is very much an American debate. I mean, I've lived most of my life in Canada and the first part of my life in England, and this is basically not, if I say it's not our problem, I don't mean to sound smug, but it's not. This is very much a debate, the creationism, evolution debate is something which has very much come up in the American context. And of course it's come up particularly because of the kind of Protestantism that developed in America, or that was in America in the 19th century. I mean, historians, I think, would agree unanimously on that. One of the things that I've become aware of in the last 20 or so years as I've been working on this is that it's a two-sided issue, that it's not just the creationists are all black or something like that, as we tend to portray them. I mean, and again, this will in fact be something I'll be talking about more in my talk tonight. But I'm very much aware that often evolutionists trail their coats, and certainly if you read people like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Jay Gould, it's pretty clear that these people have got more than just a scientific agenda, that they've got a religious agenda, and if not a social agenda. Certainly Gould has. And so it's often one that I share, but I do recognize that often we evolutionists are guilty of pretending that we're pushing science when what we're doing is pushing, if you like, our metaphysics. And so the older I get, the more, not that I get more cynical, not that I in any sense waver on my commitment to evolution, and I don't at all. But the more I do start to see that there are more issues than just simply right and wrong science and non-science, and that there are other issues. That very much is the kind of reason why I take part in debates like, or discussions as we're having this afternoon.
Thank you. Could you clarify, though, just a little bit more in the fairness of disclosure, any organizations that you belong to or participate in?
The organizations, God, I hate belonging to anything. You know, the humanists have often asked me to join up, and I say, friends, I didn't give up Christianity to take up another religion. I suppose, let me think, what do I belong to? I belong to the Philosophy of Science Association, and I belong to the International Society for History and Philosophy and Social Studies of Biology, or I belong to the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science. And there may be one or two others, the American Association and I belong to the Royal Society of Canada. But I don't belong to any political societies. I gave up, I used to belong to the New Democratic Party in Canada, which is our socialist party, but when they endorsed casinos, my Protestant background came out, and I dropped them like a hot potato. So,
Thank you. Jonathan.
Well, I'm reminded of the quip that I wouldn't join any organization that would consider having me as a member, but I actually do belong to a few scientific societies: American Society for Cell Biology, Society for Developmental Biology. I also belong to the American Academy of Religion, which is the main academic religious studies academy in North America, and a few others. I also I am a senior fellow, as you announced in the beginning, at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, which is a political think tank. So there's politics right there. Frankly, I'm not a politician. If there was a book called Politics for Dummies, and maybe there is, I should probably read it, because I'm a total dodo when it comes to that. But I will say that I think in the larger issue, this controversy occurs at many levels, as I think both of the others have acknowledged. It's a scientific controversy, it's a religious controversy, it's a political controversy. And as you pointed out, I think it's a mistake to think that only one side is playing politics. Clearly, both sides are. The scientific societies to which I belong maintain lobbyists in Washington to raise money. Those same societies frequently come out on the side of Darwinism against its opponents. So there's a clear political arm here. I think that's the American way of life. It doesn't bother me, but I do like the idea of full disclosure. And if I could just briefly respond to 2 points here. Michael, you said this is an American debate. Well, I think it's certainly much more prominent in America than overseas, but I personally know many people in England, in Canada, in France, in Australia, and elsewhere, who are involved in it. But I grant the point that it's certainly much more prominent here. Bruce said something about creationists should know about Darwinian theory. I completely agree. I have never favored taking Darwinism out of the curriculum, either at the college level or the high school level. I think it's very important for people to learn about it. But to quote Phil Johnson, or paraphrase Phil Johnson, what I would like to see is students learning more about Darwinian evolution than Darwinists would like to teach them. And I'll end with a political quote. This is from language accompanying the recently passed education bill in the U.S. Congress that said, I don't have it in front of me, but to the effect that a quality education should ensure that students be taught how to distinguish the data and testable theories of science from religious and philosophical ideas that are presented in the name of science, to which I wholeheartedly agree.
We now have a few minutes for discussion on these political dimensions, and perhaps to focus it, perhaps you could take the perspective of someone sitting here who may be sitting back and thinking, sure, it's political, I know it's political, and there's parity in the politics. We have let's say, the pro-evolutionists on one side, possibly working to maintain their scientific hegemony. We have the theists possibly on the other side trying to protect their position, and it's all the same. Everybody's just being political. Do you differ with that or not?
One of the great difficulties in this is that we have picked upon evolutionary biology and evolution by natural selection as a particular question. You know, one of the things I'd really like to see the Discovery Institute do, why don't they go out and question gravitation? Why don't they go out and question van der Waals forces? There are a variety. It's very interesting that in this claim for pursuit of science that we have picked upon one particular aspect, I think because it simply kind of hits so close to the question of what we are and who we are, that we look at evolution by natural selection, and that has become sort of the target for any questions at all. If we're really talking about this, what we should be doing is we should be talking about science as a whole and science as a way of knowing and what the shortcomings or powers of that approach are. Because whatever we find out in the final analysis is going to be applied across all of scientific disciplines, not just biology.
Michael, you're looking extremely either smug or reserved.
No, I guess I'm getting to the dried up stage. As I say, I do see I do see political issues here. The main thing I want to say is I do think that they're more complex than simply black and white, and that's been and people like Jeff will bear me out, much as he probably will never bear me out on anything else again in our whole relationship, given the way that I've been teasing him this afternoon. But I think people like Jeff will bear me out, is that I think if I've got any merit, it's the fact that I do see that these are much more complex issues than just simply black and white, good and evil, or even a Christian and scientist, and that they're very much intertwined. And I think that the way forward, and I think one of the things that we've got to do, particularly people like me and my side, if you like, have got to do a lot more work on trying to understand the whole debate at a more sociological and broader level.
Well, while agreeing with Michael that this is much more complicated than a black and white issue, I will attempt to answer Bruce's legitimate question as to why the Discovery Institute focuses so much on the evolution debate as opposed to, say, the debate over redshifts or something like that. And I'll just give two quick answers. One is, I know why I focus on it because I'm a biologist, and it seems to me that the reason I focus on it is because, as I've already said, claims are being made that, for me, go far beyond the available evidence, and in fact, in many cases, are contradicted by the evidence, and that bothers me as a scientist. Second of all, briefly, I've studied geology. I started out in geology. I got my bachelor's degree in physics, and then I studied biology. I've read books in physics, geology, chemistry, various fields of biology. And one interesting thing I've noticed is that I can read a book in chemistry or physics or even genetics and physiology, and there's not a word about religious issues. But in almost every book I read that deals with evolutionary biology, there are anti-religious statements of one form or another. And that bothers me. Why are they there? Is this science or is it something else? And that interests me, and that's one reason I'm attracted to the issue.
Would you care to define an anti-religious statement?
Sure. One of them, I think, is in something that was printed out and sent to you from Doug Fatuma's Evolutionary Biology, which I used as a graduate student at Berkeley. This is a quote from his textbook. By coupling undirected, purposeless variation to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection, Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of the life processes superfluous. Together with Marx's materialistic theory of history and society, and Freud's attribution of human behavior to influences over which we have little control, Darwin's theory of evolution was a crucial plank in the platform of mechanism and materialism.
Is that a claim for biology? Is that a historical observation that could have been as easily written in a history text?
Well, if that's in fact what Darwin's theory did, then I think we have some fundamental religious issues here that need to be addressed. Unlike other sciences.
Where'd matter come from?
Is that a scientific question?
Yes.
Well, many people would argue that it's not. That the ultimate origin of things is beyond the realm of experimental science, and that it's therefore fundamentally religious.
So I would expect in astrophysics, as there's a discussion of religion. Why aren't you guys in there having fun with astrophysicists?
Maybe because the things they say about religion or the origin of matter are more tentative and less destructive of mainstream religious belief. I don't know astrophysics, so I can't comment definitively on that.
You see, where I would want to come in on something like this is I would want to agree with Jonathan that I think that comments like that do get made. But the question is whether they have to be made when you're talking about evolutionary theory. And my argument would be that I don't see that they do. I think it's perfectly legitimate for somebody to say something along the following lines, that what Darwinism did clearly was exclude theological or whatever it is discussions from this realm. But please understand that that is the nature of science, that science is, to use the phrase, methodologically naturalistic, and that it does not necessarily preclude somebody taking a religious position, which we're not going to talk about now because we're talking about science. I mean, again, I don't want to give everything away that I'm going to be talking about tonight, but one of the things I will point out tonight is that Darwin, when he wrote The Origin of Species, was certainly a believer. So I think that one could have rephrased that particular question to make the point. I'm not saying that Doug Futuma was not an atheist and was not pushing it. So please don't, I'm not trying to exonerate him then. But this is the very point at which I want to get in there. And where I want to say, I think you can do the job better, and I think that we evolutionists should. But I think it can be done, and I think it's important that it be done.
Thank you very much. What we are going to do now is we are going to turn to student questions that have been submitted previously. I know some of you have also written questions on index cards, which will be delivered to me. I'd like to start with a question that can be addressed to any or all of you. The universe, time, space, matter, and energy came into existence in the finite past. It is so finely tuned for life that if any 50 cosmological constants had been different by very small percentages, life could not exist. The evidence for mind before matter is overwhelming. Don't the recent findings of astronomers and astrophysicists make arguments for atheistic or non-theistic evolution irrelevant and outdated?
Is that a question?
Rather a leading one.
It's a leading question, certainly.
Well, I think the question is, or at least one of the things I sort of thought I saw go by there was the idea that it seems like there are so many features of the universe as constituted that were they slightly different, life would not exist. Therefore, does that not speak to someone who has created a situation in which life would exist? Therefore, a God is present. Would you accept that as a reinterpretation?
Yes.
My response to that one is, well, life as we know it might not exist, but another form If the constants were different, might be here. We don't know.
That sounds good to me.
Could.
Here's a question for Jonathan.
It seems even that it might be probable.
Ooh, probability.
Again, Jim.
A question for Jonathan.
Well, that's outside my field, the idea of fine-tuning of the universe and the constants. I've heard the arguments. It seems to me that the fine-tuning of so many constants is consistent with the idea that the universe is designed. I've heard arguments to the effect that, well, maybe there are an infinite number of universes, and ours just happens to be the one where they all fit. Of course, I can't rule that out, but neither can anybody rule it in. How do we know whether there are an infinite number of universes or not? I just don't know. So to me, it doesn't resolve the issue, but I find it compatible with the idea of design.
Here's another question specifically for you, Jonathan. One of the most poignant icons of evolution is the horse. Evolutionary biologists say that the fossil record of the horse, which goes from the three-toed to our modern one-toed horse, is strong evidence for descent with modification. How would you understand and interpret this fairly convincing piece of evidence for evolution?
Well, the record of fossil horses, of course, is not as neat as that implies, but setting that aside, let's assume that we had a nice fossil record of horses. It comes right back to the question of fossil whales or the evolution of the mammalian ear. We have a series of intermediates, and as I said earlier, that may be descent with modification. I'm not ruling that out. On the other hand, it may be design. I'm not ruling that out either. What I would like to see is more evidence to come down on the side of Darwinian descent with modification before I accept that as a given.
But can I ask you then, if you're using the word design here, are you saying miraculous interventions and creations? I mean, is the difference here, say, between, let us say we've got three fossils, A, B, C. The evolutionist says that the descendants of A turned into B, the descendants of B turned into C. And so at any point, then you're going to have, let us say, living, running horses or whatever it is. Whereas the opposite position is, now we've got A, and at some point, we don't necessarily, whether A's have to be destroyed completely or whatever, at some point there is a miraculous change from A to B, or A's are eliminated and then B's are created anew, and then at some point, as it were, zap, zap, zap. Are these the two hypotheses that we're considering?
I think they're the two major ones, and I don't think the assertion of design needs to assert either one of those necessarily.
Well, that's my problem then. What are we arguing about then? If we're not arguing that, what are we arguing about? Because obviously there are, of course, as you know, Michael Behe is in fact an evolutionist of a kind. Now, are we arguing about...
He would agree with the second idea you proposed.
Are we arguing about evolution and whether or not it's directed, or are we arguing about evolution or not evolution? I mean, I'm not trying to pin you down now,
no, it's okay.
But I'm trying to find out where our difference is at this point.
Could I rephrase and ask, if you have just created the same question that I was going to ask, which is, Jonathan, why could you not accept the idea of intelligent design being evinced by the process of evolution by natural selection? Is that another way?
Well, that would certainly be a supplementary to what I would want to ask. But that's what I would get to. But I've not even got there. But I mean, it's certainly pertinent.
Well, watch me weasel out of this one. Could be both.
That's your philosophical training. That's your philosophical training.
That's right. No, it could be one in one situation and the other in another situation. The fossil horses might very well be an example, or the whales, of evolution that's directed. I'm using your pronunciation now. That could be true. If I see the evidence, I'll believe it. I have no problem with that. On the other hand, it could be an example of discontinuous, separate acts of design. That's very hard to distinguish in the fossil record.
I think in the fossil record, it's impossible to distinguish.
Thank you. I didn't want to say it that strongly.
Because it would be absolutely impossible to distinguish. So now the question comes, not what the fossil evidence says, is whether or not your position is more sensible than mine. And what I would want to say is the following. Of course, once again, poor old Jeff there. I'm looking at Jeff now. There he is sitting now. My eyes are closed. I do not see Jeff now. My eyes are open. I see Jeff now. Now, the question is it more reasonable for me to think that Jeff continued to be, even though in the forest, as it were, even though I wasn't looking at him? Or is it more reasonable to believe, or that it's even possible that Jeff time A and Jeff time B were separated by a gap or something like that? And I'm saying that it's just, if you like, this is my metaphysical assumption or whatever you want to call it, but I'm saying that's the way that we reason, that's the way that we think. And I want to know why now you're not willing to apply it in the fossil situation, because it seems to me to be something very similar. Metaphysically, I cannot distinguish, if you like, or at least rather physically, I cannot distinguish between Jeff continuous and not. I mean, it's David Hume's problem. But as I say, it's not reasonable to think there were two Jeffs and a space in the middle.
Well, I agree with you. I don't find that reasonable either. But the proper analogy here would be between Jeff and Australopithecus afarensis. Now, there is a gap there. There's a temporal gap, a monstrous temporal gap, not to mention a morphological
Well,
gap.
what about Jeff as a boy and Jeff as a grown-up?
That's a different issue, too.
No,
You're
it's
talking about
not.
a single
No, it's
individual.
not. No, they're different. I mean, Jeff, frankly, with all due respect to Jeff is a boy.
Well, he hasn't gotten
and Jeff
much here
as a grown-up
today.
is about as different as Australopithecus afarensis and Jeff now.
Oh,
and yet
no, come on.
Well, you never saw Jeff as a boy.
And you did.
Jeff, do we have any pictures of you as a boy to resolve this debate?
But I think you would be even more accurate if you said Jeff's father, Jeff's grandfather, and Jeff.
No, because you're still talking about the same species. And we directly observe family ties within our species. No one has ever seen a non-human turn into a human. Never.
Because
Or even close.
I would actually beg to differ very strongly on the even close. The paleoanthropologists at this point are fighting over several forms. They can't even really decide where they fit because they are so intermediate between other previously described species. And I'm very much on Michael's side on this one. At what point does a reasonable human being accept the natural evidence and put it into a context? And the question here is, you are choosing to believe that unless you were there watching every step of the way, you're not going to accept it. So you're starting off from a basic precept of belief.
Well, it seems to me that belief is ubiquitous here, but I'll set that aside.
Yes, I believe in science. I agree with that. I believe in science just
as
like...
natural explanation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, science is a belief knowledge.
I agree that it would be unreasonable for me to insist on watching Australopithecus afarensis morph into Jeff Schloss. Poor Jeff. Sorry. I think it is reasonable, however, for a scientist, before making a claim as broad as that made in evolutionary biology, and asserted, by the way, to be that without which biology can no longer be done, to see evidence of a process that it's reasonable to extrapolate to cover that gap. Okay, I have not seen the evidence for that process. I've seen natural selection within species. I've seen mutation that's beneficial at a trivial biochemical level, not a morphological or anatomical level. The combination of the two, I'm told, extrapolated over geological time, will get me from Lucy to Jeff, and I don't see it. I don't see why I should make that extrapolation.
But now, I've never seen a molecule, or rather an electron, which is both a particle and a wave at the same time. So am I to say then it's not reasonable for me to believe in electrons having these contradictory or apparently contradictory properties? I mean, this is the way that you work in science. You work on the evidence and you put the evidence together. And what I think is you're playing fast and loose with the evidence, Jonathan. I think that sometimes you're prepared to accept one level of evidence, but other times, and I hate to say this, but I think because of your religious commitments, you're upping the barrier or upping the standards so high that we simply can't jump over them.
Well, I think I've set the barrier fairly consistently here to ask for evidence of a process that will get me from one species of one anatomical form to another species.
But you see, you keep shifting back and forth over
Well, I don't want to keep saying the same thing.
And this goes back to, if you don't like Jeff, let's take Jim. Jim suddenly,
I do like
Jim
Jeff.
drops
Wait
his
a minute,
pants
you're
and
the one who
runs
doesn't
out.
like Jeff.
I mean, I feel, by the way, that we should have
Pay you
Jeff
for
on
nothing.
television so that when this film is shown, everybody knows who the hero of this afternoon is. You're just jealous, Brendan, because I haven't been making a fool of you. Not that I'd be making a fool of Jeff, you understand.
An icon. By the way, I made a misstatement earlier that I want very seriously to correct. I said I spoke of science as belief and knowledge, and that was inappropriate. Research knowledge and belief knowledge are two different ways of knowing the world. Science follows from research knowledge. One chooses to believe to use that approach in one's approach to the world as a scientist. And that is, in a sense, a belief choice if you choose to follow science. But once you have made that choice, you then must work within the constraints, within the context and the codified approach of science in an honest manner. And so I tripped over my words earlier. I wanted to make absolutely certain somebody didn't go out of here and said, Tiffney said science was a belief knowledge. No, science, the scientific methodology associated in research knowledge is something you make a personal belief to accept. But once you've done that, you are then constrained. You have to follow the rules inside of it. You cannot invoke a miracle or whatever. You know, it's that classic cartoon of Einstein at the board, and there's a big blank in the middle of all the equations, and a miracle occurs here. No.
Actually, I believe in science in that sense. I have made that belief commitment to follow the research program, to do experiments, to see where the evidence leads me. My problem is that when we talk about this Darwinian mechanism that's supposed to accomplish so much, and we look at it in real organisms, we don't see it accomplishing that. For example, look at bacteria. One quick example. Bacteria have rapid generation times, in some cases 15 or 20 minutes. We can mutate them almost endlessly. We've been working on them for 150 years, subjecting them to incredible selection protocols. In 150 years, no one has seen a new species of bacterium evolve. Now, where's the justification for an extrapolation there?
I'm not a bacteriologist. I know some bacteriologists. I think they would have some strong difficulties with that statement.
Yes, but there's certainly a lot. I mean, I agree with you here, Bruce. But there's certainly a lot of other evidence that natural selection is working. I mean, for instance, the Hymenoptera. Let's take the work that the late William Hamilton worked on. The reasons why we find different casts in the Hymenoptera, why we find different sex ratios and these sorts of things, which are certainly lead to predictions where one can go out and measure and these sorts of things, and in fact the predictions do come out. We've got people like her who's been working on the Panamanian fig wasp, for instance, and where you get very distorted sex ratios. Instead of, as in humans, roughly 50-50, what you'll get is 20-80 or that sort of thing, and where one can make predictions, and these things work, and they're using natural selection. You see, so often, once again, the thing is, unless we see natural selection turning dinosaurs into birds, I'm not going to accept natural selection. But that's not the way that science works. I mean, science works through short-term things, through experiment. I mean, it does in physics, and it does in biology, and this is the way that one works. And one finds that one can use natural selection as a very precise tool, if you like, of investigation, to look at things like fig wasps, to look at things like the work that Resnick has been doing for the last 20 years on guppies in Trinidad, and these things. And intelligent design doesn't help us very much at this level. I mean, your field too, I'm sure, Bruce. I mean, you know, people who are working on plants. It's very similar sorts of things coming up there.
When I said natural selection was the hypothesis that had the greatest predictive power and had withstood attempts at falsification, what I was doing was making the general statement to which you are now providing the particulars.
Well, my only rejoinder to that then would be that when we look at these experiments, which are certainly going on and which are certainly bearing fruit, I would say very limited fruit, I would say then if we're going to extrapolate those results to make claims about a 3.8 billion year history of life and call that a fact, it seems to me that extrapolation is not warranted. We should be a great deal more tentative about claims we're making for the distant past.
But then, Bruce, we can come. Oh, sorry. Then, Jonathan, we can come back and say that's fair enough. And certainly, somebody like Stephen Jay Gould would say exactly what you're saying. But do notice that what Gould would say is, but of course we're doing this within the context of an overall belief in evolution. Now we're going to argue about the mechanisms. And Gould would certainly make exactly that point. Gould would say, I agree entirely about fig wasps, but this does not tell me about macroevolution. I've got to invoke other things. Now, but you, it seems to me, want to go further than that. You want to say, but because you can't extrapolate from fig wasps to dinosaurs, that means that evolution isn't a reasonable position to take.
I didn't say it wasn't reasonable, but I will agree with you, as you just said, that it is a belief system.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry, I'm playing tricks with you.
Everything's a belief system. I mean, you can't have a belief without having a belief system. The question is, but you're using belief system we all know what Jeff Slosh's belief system is. That's why he beats the shit out of his wife. I mean, that's, belief system, which is being used in a pejorative sense. I've got a belief system. I mean, you're using it in, why doesn't he stop beating his wife sense? Why is it that you don't stop by saying there's debate about the mechanisms, but the overall background of evolution is well taken?
Because I don't believe it, as you do. And,
Okay.
and I
Well,
think Bruce has a problem with the belief system idea here.
Well, I would certainly say that I accept evolution by natural selection as the most powerful hypothesis. I do not believe in it, and somebody comes up with a better hypothesis, which is another reason, by the way, that in one sense this is sort of a spurious debate to have, because, hey, you want the nearest to a Nobel Prize that exists in organismal biology, go prove evolution by natural selection wrong, and you will be offered chaired professorships, the Nobel Prize equivalent, and everything else the world around. It is not as though science has not been testing these questions in great and disgusting detail, because whoever finds out a major flaw in Darwinian thinking is going to be the next chaired professor at the university of their choice.
Very briefly, Bruce, and then Jonathan has a very brief comment. We're going to move on.
Sorry,
If you have something more to say, go ahead, but briefly, please.
I'll try. I'd just like to come back to almost where we started off with and ask Jonathan a question based upon the contentions of not seeing many of the mechanisms that he would expect to see for evolution by natural selection demonstrated in the nitty-gritty of day-to-day science. In the context of science, what is the role of the observer in terms of fairly reporting everything that he or she has seen or read?
What is the role of the observer in fairly reporting?
In science, in reporting on everything that he or she has seen or read or that pertains to the subject.
Well, I've already said that science is the pursuit of truth, but whether anybody can fairly cite everything they've read, I think, is questionable. I'm not sure what you're getting at there. Can I add something about your previous comment?
Go ahead.
That someone who seriously questions Darwinian evolution and brings up valid arguments against it will win a Nobel Prize and a tenured chair. I don't see that at all. What actually happens is that people who seriously question Darwinian evolution, unless they already have tenure, are out of a job. I mean, the word creationist now is the modern equivalent of what communist was back in the 50s. You call somebody a creationist, and you're basically condemning them to being without a career in biology. That's the fact.
Because they're operating outside of science. But if within science you could demonstrate that evolution by natural selection was not correct, I disagree with you. You would get the chaired professorship. You bet. That's what what do you think Stephen Jay Gould spent the early portion of his career trying to do, was literally disprove Darwin.
Briefly, and then we're going to move on.
To prove
Yes, go ahead,
science wrong within the naturalistic framework that you're prescribing, to me, all it takes is to show that it does not, the evidence fails the predictions that are made for it. Now, you say that you have to propose a new theory. I'm not so sure. Let's say I had a theory of gravity that says things should fall upwards. Do you need a new theory to prove me wrong? No, you just see what happens.
Didn't work, did it? Science strikes again.
Yeah, so my hypothesis is wrong. You did not need a counter theory. That's my point. If evolution by natural selection is wrong as a general history of the story of the history of life, it can be proven wrong by the evidence without any counter hypothesis. That's the way science ought to work if it's a search for truth.
Not unless you advance another hypothesis that better explains the evidence within a scientific context.
Within a naturalistic context.
Within a naturalistic context.
But what if naturalism is not the answer? That was my original point.
Naturalism is the only way that science can function, because as soon as you would put anything that is supernatural into it, then whatever result you get is whatever result you want to believe in, and we've abandoned the power of science.
What if, now I'm not saying this as an assertion, what if God created Adam and Eve? What if? I mean, it could have happened. As a conceptual matter, it could have happened. You're saying it couldn't have?
Well, it's just, we go back to Bruce could be, Men in Black could be right. Bruce could be, an alien put there, and suddenly he's going to start doing this as he gives birth in the back of a car. But it's not, it's not a reasonable position to take. Jeff putting his head down and praying that I don't pick on him again.
I'd like to...
Maybe he's praying because I brought up Adam and Eve.
Okay. This is a very interesting discussion. In deference to the student questions, which, by the way, are excellent, and we won't be able to cover all of them, but I'd like to move to a different type of question, okay? This is a quote, George Gaylord Simpson, a little bit on the meaning of evolution, rather than perhaps its truth. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Can you please comment on that? On ramifications of belief or not in evolution for the meaning of human life?
Well, if I was going to be George Gaylord, I would not have used the word purposeless, because it has too many implications with it. I define evolution by natural selection as the interaction of random genetic variation with random environmental change leading to differential survival and reproduction. Random in both cases means the organism in question could not control its genetics nor the environment in which it was going to meet. And the interaction of those two features is what we call natural selection. It's simply that differential survival. But I would say that he has caught the essence of it, that it is a naturalistic set of processes. And this is where I am now going to take off my science hat and put on my belief hat and say that my personal take on this is that it puts an enormous responsibility on us as the first sentient organisms to come around on this planet who really understand the totality of our history and where we live. We have an enormous responsibility to live up to that.
Shall I go
Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I think there's two levels to this claim. First of all, I think obviously the word purpose is the key one there. I think that within the context of science, there's a debate about whether or not man or humans are at some level the predictable, if you like, culmination of the evolutionary process. And frankly, there's a debate amongst evolutionists about this. People like Gould, for instance, want to say that evolution is totally without direction. People like Ed Wilson, on the other hand, want to say that evolution does have a direction, and that once you've got evolution going, that humans or human-like entities, if you like, would emerge. I mean, it's rather like you've got sort of water, land, air, and culture, and at some point we're going to break through. Not necessarily looking quite like us, but that it would happen. And that's a debate going on amongst the scientists. Some days I think it goes one way, some days I think it goes the other way. But as far as I think there's also a second level, and it's pretty clear that Simpson had got this in mind as well. And this, of course, is where I start to worry, because it seems to me that Simpson is extrapolating from his scientific beliefs to making a broader, if you like, metaphysical or religio-theological sort of claim. And I don't see that that follows at all. I still think it's perfectly possible for somebody to say that that whatever is going on within the scientific context, but it doesn't at all follow that humans weren't meaningful to a god or something like that. I mean, somebody like Ernan McMullen, who's an Augustinian on this, says, I don't see any progress, but humans did emerge, and God could do it whichever way he wanted. So I think there's two levels here. And I suspect that, of course, that what Simpson is doing is precisely what worries me about what a lot of evolutionists do. He's making what seems to be an eminently sensible scientific claim, but at the same time, either overtly or covertly, he's nudging into a religious claim as well.
Well, as I think you've demonstrated, this is a debate within evolutionary biology itself. I think the mechanism is essentially random, as Bruce pointed out, and I think if we rely on that, then we get randomness or purposelessness. But I also happen to think that there is a higher dimension here, something else at work. I'd just like to end with a brief anecdote. I just recently came back from the University of Connecticut because you asked, Jim, what are the larger ramifications for this? And it seems to me that there's an elephant in the room right now that we're not talking about so much.
Jeff?
No, not Jeff Schloss.
Do you have the tail or the trunk?
I'm talking about God. I'm talking about God. Now, is God real or not? That's one question that's underlying a lot of these discussions, and we obviously come down on different sides. As I say, I came back from the University of Connecticut where I spoke about textbook misrepresentations of the evidence for evolution, and a letter to the editor of the campus newspaper responding to my coming didn't say anything at all about the textbooks, didn't say anything at all about evolution, but said, keep your religion to yourself. By the way, I didn't talk about religion in my talk. Keep your religion to yourself because I want to be free to party and have sex and stay up late and do anything I want. Now, I'm not saying this is true of all evolutionary biologists. It certainly is not. Or maybe it is. I don't know.
I must say, I didn't realize my 15-year-old daughter was writing to the press in Connecticut, but go on.
But the reason I bring it up is because I think there is a larger issue here. If we are indeed products of random natural processes, and there is no God, then there is no higher power to which we are responsible or accountable. We can do whatever we want. Hopefully we won't go extinct because that's the ultimate Darwinian sin. But basically our behavior is totally unconstrained. That's an issue here. And obviously, for many people, that's the crucial issue.
Bruce, Michael?
Well, we're opening up such a huge kind of metaphysical worms here that one hardly knows where to start. I mean, I just don't think it's true, for instance, that if God doesn't exist, all things are permitted. I know Sartre or others have said that, but I don't see that why one can't have morality just as much whether or not God exists. Certainly, when I lost my faith at the age of 20, I didn't suddenly start saying, okay, folks, it's okay to cheat on papers now, or something like that. Never, if anybody had said that to me, I would have looked at them as though they were queer in the head. So I just don't see that you can draw that kind of connection. Having said that, at the same time, I think Jonathan is right, because there's no question but that the God issue is in the room, if you like, even if we've not been talking about it clearly. And and I would defend absolutely, and in fact I wrote a book about this, whilst I would say that there's absolutely no reason why one can't be a hardline Darwinian and a good Christian at the same time, there's no question but that, as a matter of fact, a lot of people do associate these in different sorts of ways, and that people's beliefs and attitudes about these things are affected by this, including my fellow evolutionists. So I think you're right that the God issue is there. What exactly the God issue is and what the connections are, well, give me another grant and I'll write another book, because that's what I do for a living.
I'd like to thank you three very much for your discussion. I would like to offer you each 1 minute for a brief closing comments, remembering this is not a debate and not a chance to score your final victory, but simply to observe on the discussion that we've begun and that will surely continue after we finish today. Bruce, would you like to begin?
If I would wish anything for the world, it was that the world learn to use two of the great powers of human intellect, belief knowledge and the invention of science and research knowledge, not confuse the two with each other, keep them separate, and use each to its full power.
Jonathan.
Well, I've already confessed that I love controversy, so I think my parting word would be keep it up. I mean, obviously we disagree here. I love it when we can air our differences in a civil atmosphere like this with lots of jokes, and I've enjoyed this very much, and thank you for coming.
Michael.
Well, I'm a university professor, and so I'm always a university professor, so the most important people in this room are not us, but the students. And I want to say to you kids who've come along, first of all, thanks very much for turning out. And secondly, think about what we're talking about, because these are important issues. Even if they're not on the test, these are really important issues to you as a human being. And I hope that you won't agree with me, won't agree with any of us, that you'll make your own minds up, but I hope you will think about them and talk about them. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Thank you all very much for participating today. Let's remember that tonight, right here at 7 p.m., Professor Michael Ruse will present a talk on Darwin, and tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in Isla Vista Theater, Professor Bruce Tiffney will present the second of our lectures on Darwin for this month. Thank you very much. I hope to see you then.
I really enjoyed that.
As one of my old theology professors used to say, you're absolutely brilliant and totally wrong.
I know, I love it.